sessions to get through here. But Ecclesiastes, we can go ahead and get in one class session. And Ecclesiastes is a book where people, for the most part, don't read it, or they read it fast because they got to get through 4 chapters in a night, and they just crank through it here. So we don't necessarily pay attention. So I'm going to read from a different translation. It's the New English translation here. So if you want to follow along, you certainly can follow along on your translation. If you just want to listen, that's fine too. You want to remember that Ecclesiastes was written to be listened to. So every year, the Jewish nation as a whole, during one of their feasts, heard the recitation of Ecclesiastes. And then I will note when I change each chapter, but no verses here. So chapter 1, the words of the teacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Futile, futile, laments the teacher. Absolutely futile. Everything is futile. What benefit do people get from all the effort which they expend on earth? The generation comes and the generation goes, but the earth remains the same through the ages. The sun rises and the sun sets. It hurries away to place from which it rises again. The wind goes to the south and circles around to the north. Round and round the wind goes, and around it returns. All the streams flow into the sea, but the sea is not full. And to the place where the streams flow, they will flow again. All this monotony is tiresome. No one can bear it. No one can bear to describe it. The eye is never satisfied with seeing, nor is the ear ever content with hearing. What exists now is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There is nothing truly new on earth. Is there anything about which someone can say, look at this, it is new? It was already done long ago, before our time. No one remembers the former events, nor will anyone remember the events that they are yet to happen. They will not be remembered by future generations. I, the teacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem. I decided to carefully and thoroughly examine all that has been accomplished on earth. I concluded God has given people a burdensome task that keeps them occupied. I reflected on this that is accomplished by man on earth, and I concluded everything he has accomplished is futile, like chasing the wind. What is bent cannot be straightened, and what is missing cannot be supplied. I thought to myself, I have become much wiser than any of my predecessors who have ruled over Jerusalem. I have acquired much wisdom and knowledge. So I decided to discern the benefits of wisdom and knowledge over foolish ideas and behaviors. However, I conclude that even this endeavor is like trying to chase the wind. For with great wisdom comes great frustration. Whoever increases his knowledge merely increases his heartache. Chapter 2. I thought to myself, come now, I will try self-indulgent pleasure to see if it is worthwhile. But I found that is also futile. I said of partying, it is folly, and of self-indulgent pleasure, it accomplishes nothing. I thought deeply about the effects of indulging myself with wine, all the while my mind was guiding me with wisdom, and the effects of behaving foolishly, so that I might discover what is profitable for people to do on earth during the few days of their lives. I increased my possessions. I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards for myself. I designed royal gardens and parks for myself, and I planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I constructed pools of water for myself to irrigate my groves of flourishing trees. I purchased male and female slaves, and I owned slaves who were born in my house. I also possessed more livestock, both herds, and flocks, than any of my predecessors in Jerusalem. I also amassed silver and gold for myself, as well as valuable treasure taken from kingdoms and provinces. I acquired male and female singers for myself. And what gives a man sensual delight? A harem of beautiful concubines. So I was far wealthier than all my predecessors in Jerusalem, yet I maintained my objectivity. I did not restrain myself from getting whatever I wanted. I did not deny myself anything that would bring me pleasure. So all my accomplishments gave me joy. This was my reward for all my effort. Yet, when I reflected on everything I had accomplished and all the effort that I had expended to accomplish it, I concluded all these achievements, possessions are ultimately profitless, like chasing the wind. There is nothing gained from them on earth. Next, I decided to consider wisdom, as well as foolish behavior and ideas. For what more can the king's successor do than that what the king has already done? I realized that wisdom is preferable to folly, just as light is preferable to darkness. The wise man can see where he is going, but the fool walks in darkness. Yet, I also realize that the same fate happens to them both. So I thought to myself, the fate of the fool will happen even to me. Then what did I gain by becoming so excessively wise? So I lamented to myself, the benefits of wisdom are ultimately meaningless. For the wise man, like the fool, will not be remembered for very long, because in the days to come, both will already have been forgotten. Alas, the wise man dies just like the fool. So I loathe life because of what happens on earth seems awful to me, for all the benefits of wisdom are futile, like chasing the wind. So I loathe all the fruit of my effort, for which I worked so hard on earth, because I must leave it behind in the hands of my successor. Who knows if he'll be a wise man or a fool? Yet he'll be master over all the fruit of my labor, for which I worked so wisely on earth. This is also futile. So I began to despair about the fruit of my labor, for which I'd worked so hard on earth. For a man may do his work with wisdom, knowledge, and skill. However, he must hand over the fruit of his labor as an inheritance to someone else who did not work for it. This also is futile and an awful injustice. What does man acquire from all his labor and from the anxiety that accompanies his toil on earth? For all day long his work produces pain and frustration, and even at night his mind cannot relax. This also is futile. There is nothing better for people than to eat and drink and to find enjoyment in their work. I also perceive that this ability to find enjoyment comes from God, for no one can eat and drink or experience joy apart from him. For to the one who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and joy. But to the sinner, he gives the task of amassing wealth, only to give to the one who pleases God. The task of the wicked is futile, like chasing the wind. Chapter 3. For everything there is an appointed time, an appropriate time for every activity on earth, a time to be born, and a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to uproot what was planted, a time to kill, and a time to heal, a time to break down, and a time to build up, a time to weep, and a time to laugh, a time to mourn, and a time to dance, a time to throw away stones, and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search, and a time to give something up as lost, a time to keep, and a time to throw away, a time to rip, and a time to sow, a time to keep silent, and a time to speak, a time to love, and a time to hate, a time for war, and a time for peace. What benefit can a worker gain from his toil? I observe the burden that God has given to people to keep them occupied. God has made everything fit beautifully in its appropriate time, but he has also placed ignorance in the human heart, so that people cannot discover what God has ordained from the beginning to the end of their lives. I have concluded that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and to enjoy themselves as long as they live, and also that everyone should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil, for these things are a gift from God. I also know that whatever God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it, nothing can be taken away from it. God has made it this way so men will fear him. Whatever exists now has already been, and whatever will be has already been. For God will seek to do again what has occurred in the past. I saw something else on earth. In the place of justice there was wickedness. In the place of fairness there was wickedness. I thought to myself, God will judge both the righteous and the wicked, for there is an appropriate time for every activity, and there is a time of judgment for even every deed. I also thought to myself, it is for the sake of people, so God can clearly show them that they are like animals. For the fate of humans and the fate of animals are the same. As one dies, so dies the other. Both have the same breath. There is no advantage for humans over animals, for both are fleeting. Both go to the same place, both come from dust, and to dust both return. Who really knows if the human spirit ascends upward, and if the animal's spirit descends into the earth? So I perceive there is nothing better than for people to enjoy their work, because that is their reward. For who can show them what the future holds? Chapter 4. So I again considered all the oppression that continually occurs on earth. This is what I saw. The oppressed were in tears, but no one was comforting them. No one delivers them from the power of their oppressors. So I considered those who are dead and gone more fortunate than those who are still alive. But better than both is the one who has not been born, has not seen the evil things that are done on earth. Then I considered all the skillful work that is done. Surely there's nothing more than competition between one person and another. This is also profitless, like chasing the wind. The fool folds his hands and does no work, so he has nothing to eat but his own flesh. Better is one handful with some rest than 2 hands full of toil and chasing the wind. So I again considered another futile thing on earth, a man who is all alone with no companions. He has no children, no siblings, yet there is no end to his toil, and he is never satisfied with riches. He laments, "For whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure?" This is also futile and a burdensome task. 2 people are better than one because they can reap more benefit from their labor. For if they fall, one will help his companion up, but pity the person who falls down and has no one to help him up. Furthermore, if 2 lie down, they can keep each other warm. But how can one person keep him warm by himself? Although an assailant may overpower one person, 2 can withstand him. Moreover, a 3-stranded cord is not quickly broken. A poor but wise youth is better than an old and foolish king who no longer knows how to receive advice. For he came out of prison to become king, even though he had been born poor in what would become his kingdom. I consider all the living who walk on earth, as well as his successor who would rise in his place. There is no end to all the people, nor to the past generations, yet future generations will not rejoice in him. This is also profitless and like chasing the wind. Chapter 5. Be careful what you do when you go to the temple of God. Draw near to listen rather than to offer a sacrifice like fools, for they do not realize that they are doing wrong. Do not be rash with your mouth or hasty in your heart to bring up a matter before God, for God is in heaven and you are on earth. Therefore let your words be few. Just as dreams come when they are in many cares, so the rash vow of fool occurs when there are many words. When you make a vow to God, do not delay in paying it, for God takes no pleasure in fools. Pay what you vow. It is better for you not to vow than to vow and not pay it. Do not let your mouth cause you to sin, and do not tell the priest it was a mistake. Why make God angry at you so that he would destroy the works of your hands? Just as there are futility in many dreams, so also many words. Therefore, fear God. If you see the extortion of the poor or the perversion of the justice and fairness in the government, do not be astonished by this matter. For the high official is watched by a higher official, and there are higher ones over them. The produce of the land is seized by all of them, and even the king is served by the fields. The one who loves money will never be satisfied with money. He who loves wealth will never be satisfied with his income. This is also futile. When someone's prosperity increases, those who consume it also increase. So what does its owner gain except that he gets to see it with his eyes? The sleep of the laborer is pleasant, whether he eats little or much. But the wealth of the rich will not allow him to sleep. Here is a misfortune on earth that I have seen, wealth hoarded by its owner to his own misery. Then that wealth was lost through bad luck. Although he fathered a son, he had nothing left to give him. Just as he came forth from his mother's womb, naked will he return as he came. And he will take nothing in his hand that he may carry away from his toil. This is another misfortune. Just as he came, so will he go. What did he gain from toiling for the wind? Surely he ate in darkness every day of his life and suffered greatly with sickness and anger. I have seen personally what is the only beneficial and appropriate course of action for people, to eat and drink and find enjoyment in their hard work on earth during the few days of their life that God has given them, for this is their reward. To every man who God has given wealth and possessions, he's also given him the ability to eat from them, to receive his reward and find enjoyment in his toil. These things are the gift of God. For he who does not think much about the fleeting days of his life, because God keeps him preoccupied with the joy he derives from his activity. Chapter 6. Here is another misfortune that I've seen on earth, and it weighs heavily on people. God gives man riches, property, and wealth, so that he lacks nothing that his heart desires. Yet God does not enable him to enjoy the fruit of his labor. Instead, someone else enjoys it. This is fruitless and grave misfortune. Even if man fathers 100 children and lives many years, even if he lives a long, long time but cannot enjoy his prosperity, even if he were to live forever, I would say a stillborn child is better off than he is. Though the stillborn child came into the world for no reason and departed into darkness, though its name is shrouded in darkness, though it never saw the light of day nor knew anything, yet it has more rest than that man. If he should live 1,000 years twice, it does not enjoy his prosperity, but for both of them die. All the man's labor is for nothing more than to fill his stomach, yet his appetite is never satisfied. So what advantage does a wise man have over a fool? What advantage does a pauper gain by knowing how to survive? It is better to be content with what the eyes can see than for one's heart always to crave more. This continual longing is futile, like chasing the wind. Whatever has happened was foreordained. What happens to a person was also foreknown. It is useless for him to argue with God about his fate because God is more powerful than he is. The more one argues with words, the less he accomplishes. How does that benefit him? For no one knows what is best for a person during his life, during the few days of his fleeting life, for they pass away like a shadow. Nor can anyone tell him what the future will hold on for him on earth. Chapter 7. A good reputation is better than precious perfume. Likewise, the day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth. It is better to go to a funeral than a feast. For death is the destiny of every person, and the living should take this to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, because sober reflection is good for the heart. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of merrymaking. It is better for a person to receive rebuke from those who are wise than to listen to the song of fools. For like the crackling of quick-burning thorns in their cooking pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This kind of folly also is useless. Surely oppression can turn a wise person into a fool. Likewise, a bribe corrupts the heart. The end of a matter is better than its beginning. Likewise, patience is better than pride. Do not let yourself be quickly provoked, for anger resides in the lap of fools. Do not say, why were the old days better than these days? For it is not wise to ask that. Wisdom, like an inheritance, is a good thing. It benefits those who see the light of day, for wisdom provides protection, just as money provides protection. But the advantage of knowledge is this: wisdom preserves the life of its owner. Consider the work of God, for who can make straight what he has bent? In times of prosperity, be joyful. But in times of adversity, consider this: God has made one as well as the other, so that no one can discover what the future holds. During the days of my fleeting life, I have seen both of these things. Sometimes a righteous person dies prematurely in spite of his righteousness. And sometimes a wicked person lives long in spite of his evil deeds. So do not be excessively righteous or excessively wise, otherwise you might be disappointed. Do not be excessively wicked, and do not be a fool, otherwise you might die before your time. It is best to take hold of one warning without letting go of the other warning, for the one who fears God will follow both warnings. Wisdom gives a wise person more protection than 10 rulers in a city, for there is not one truly righteous person on the earth who continually does good and never sins. Also, do not pay attention to everything that people say, otherwise you might even hear your servants cursing you. For you know in your own heart that you also have cursed others many times. I have examined all this by wisdom. I said, I am determined to comprehend this, but it was beyond my grasp. Whatever has happened is beyond human understanding. It is far deeper than anyone can fathom. I tried to understand, examine, and comprehend the role of wisdom in the scheme of things, and to understand the stupidity of wickedness and insanity of folly. I discovered this: more bitter than death is the kind of woman who is like a hunter's snare. Her heart is like a hunter's net, and her hand are like prison chains. The man who pleases God escapes her, but the sinner is captured by her. The teacher says, I discovered this while trying to discover the scheme of things, item by item. What I have continually sought, I have not found. But I have found only one upright man among 1,000. But I have not found one upright woman among all of them. This alone have I discovered: God made humankind upright, but they have sought many evil schemes. Chapter 8. Who is a wise person? Who knows the solution to a problem? A person's wisdom brightens his appearance and softens his harsh countenance. Obey the king's command, because you took an oath before God to be loyal to him. Do not rush out of the king's presence in haste. Do not delay when the matter is unpleasant, for he can do whatever he pleases. Surely the king's authority is absolute. No one can say to him, what are you doing? Whoever obeys his command will not experience harm, and a wise person knows the proper time and procedure. For there is a proper time and procedure for every matter. For the oppression of the king is severe upon his victim. Surely no one knows the future. No one can tell another person what will happen. Just as no one has power over the wind to restrain it, so no one has power the day of his death. Just as no one can be discharged during the battle, so wickedness cannot rescue the wicked. While applying my mind to everything that's happened in this world, I have seen all this. Sometimes one person dominates other people to their harm. Not only that, but I have seen the wicked approaching and entering the temple. As they left the holy temple, they boasted in the city they had done so. This also is an enigma. When a sentence is not executed at once against a crime, the human heart is encouraged to do evil. Even though a sinner might commit 100 crimes and still live a long time, yet I know it will go well with God-fearing people, for they stand in fear before him. But it will not go well with the wicked, nor will they prolong their days like a shadow, because they do not stand in fear before God. Here is another enigma that occurs on earth. Sometimes there are righteous people who get what the wicked deserve. Sometimes there are wicked people who get what the righteous deserve. I said this is also an enigma. So I recommend the enjoyment of life, for there's nothing better on earth for a person to do except to eat, drink, and enjoy life. So joy will accompany him in his toil during the days of his life that God gives him on earth. When I tried to gain wisdom and to observe the activity on earth, even though it prevents anyone from sleeping day or night, then I discerned all that God has done. No one really comprehends what happens on earth. Despite all human efforts to discover it, no one can ever grasp it. Even a wise person claims that he understands, he would not really comprehend it. Chapter 9. So I reflected on this, attempting to clear it all up. I concluded that the righteous and the wise, as well as their works, are in the hand of God. Whether a person will be loved or hated, no one knows what lies ahead. Everyone shares the same fate, the righteous and the wicked, the good and the bad, the ceremonially clean and unclean, those who offer sacrifices and those who do not. What happens to the good person also happens to the sinner. What happens to those who make vows also happens to those who are afraid to make vows. This is an unfortunate fact about everything that happens on earth. The same fate awaits everyone. In addition to this, the heart of all people are full of evil, and there is folly in their hearts during their lives, then they die. But whoever is among the living has hope. A live dog is better than a dead lion. For the living know that they will die, but the dead do not know anything. They have no further reward, and even the memory of them disappears. What they loved as well as what they hated and envied perished long ago. They no longer have a part in anything that happens on earth. Go, eat your food with joy, and drink your wine with a happy heart, because God has already approved of your works. Let your clothes always be white, and do not spare precious ointment on your head. Enjoy life with your beloved wife during all the days of your fleeting life that God has given you on earth during all your fleeting days. For this is your reward in life and your burdensome work on earth. Whatever you find to do with your hands, do with all your might, because there is neither work, nor planning, nor knowledge, nor wisdom in the grave, the place where you will eventually go. Again, I observe this on the earth. The race is not always won by the swiftest. The battle is not always won by the strongest. Prosperity does not always belong to those who are the wisest. Wealth does not always belong to those who are most discerning. Nor does success always come to those with the most knowledge, for time and chance may overcome them all. Surely no one knows his appointed time. Like fish that are caught in a deadly snare, and like birds that are caught in a snare, just like them, all people are ensnared at an unfortunate time that falls upon them suddenly. This is what I also observed about wisdom on earth, and it is a great burden to me. There was once a small city with a few men in it, and a mighty king attacked it, besieging it and building strong siege works against it. However, a poor but wise man lived in the city, and he could have delivered the city by his wisdom, but no one listened to that poor man. So I concluded that wisdom is better than might, but a poor man's wisdom is despised. No one ever listens to his advice. The words of the wise are heard in quiet, more than the shouting of a ruler is heard among fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner can destroy much that is good. Chapter 10. One dead fly makes a perfumer's ointment give off a rancid stench, so little folly can outweigh much wisdom. A wise person's good sense protects him, but a fool's lack of sense leaves him vulnerable. Even when a fool walks along the road, he lacks sense and shows everyone what a fool he is. If the anger of a ruler flares up against you, do not resign from your position, for a calm response can undo great offense. I have seen another misfortune on the earth. It is an error a ruler makes. Fools are placed in many positions of authority, while wealthy men sit in lowly positions. I have seen slaves on horseback and princes walking on foot like slaves. Because, one who digs a pit may fall into it. So just a second here. I have seen slaves on horseback and princes walking on foot like slaves. One who digs a pit may fall into it, and one who breaks through a wall may be bitten by a snake. One who quarries stone may be injured by them. One who splits log may be endangered by them. If an iron axe head is blunt, and a workman does not sharpen its edge, he must exert a great deal of effort. So wisdom has the advantage of giving success. If the snake should bite before it is charmed, the snake charmer is in trouble. The words of the wise person will win him favor, but the words of a fool are self-destructive. At the beginning his words are foolish, and at the end his talk is wicked madness. Yet a fool keeps on babbling. No one knows what will happen. Who can tell him what will happen in the future? The toil of a stupid fool wears him out, because he does not even know the way to the city. Woe to you, O land, when your king is childish, and your princes feast in the morning. Blessed are you, O land, when your king is a son of nobility, and your princes feast at the proper time with self-control and not in drunkenness. Because of the laziness, the roof caves in. Because of idle hands, the house leaks. Feasts are made for laughter, and wine makes life merry. But money is the answer for everything. Do not curse a king even in your thoughts, and do not curse the rich while in your bedroom. For a bird might report what you are thinking, or some winged creature might repeat your words. Chapter 11. Send your grain overseas, for after many days you will get a return. Divide your merchandise among 7 or even 8 investments, for you do not know what calamity may happen on earth. If the clouds are full of rain, they will empty themselves on the earth. And whether a tree falls to the south or to the north, the tree will lie wherever it falls. He who catches the wind will not sow, and he who observes the clouds will not reap. Just as you do not know the path of the wind, or how the bones form in the womb of a pregnant woman, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. Sow your seed in the morning, and do not stop working until the evening, for you do not know which activity will succeed, whether this one or that, whether one will, or whether both will prosper equally. Light is sweet, and it is pleasant for a person to see the sun. So if a man lives many years, let him rejoice in them all. But let him remember that the days of darkness will be many. All this is about to come is obscure. Rejoice, young man, while you're young, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Follow the impulses of your heart and the desires of your eyes, but know that God will judge your motives and action. Banish stress, emotional stress from your mind, and put away pain from your body, for youth and the prime of life are fleeting. Chapter 12. So remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the difficult days come, and the years draw near when you will say, I have no pleasure in them. Before the sun, the light of the moon, and the stars grow dark, and the clouds disappear after the rain, when those who keep watch over the house begin to tremble, and the virile men begin to stoop over, and the grinders begin to cease because they grow few, and those who look through the windows grow dim, and the doors along the street are shut when the sound of the grinding mill grows low. And one is awakened by the sound of a bird, and all their songs grow faint. And they are afraid of heights and the dangers in the street. The almond blossoms grow white, and the grasshoppers drag itself along. The caper berry shrivels up, because man goes to his eternal home, and the mourners go about in the streets. Before the silver cord is broken, or the golden bowl is shattered, or the pitcher is shattered at the well, or a water wheel is broken at the cistern, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, and life's breath returns to God who gave it. Absolutely futile, laments the teacher. All these things are futile. Not only was the teacher wise, but he also taught knowledge to the people. He carefully evaluated and arranged many proverbs. The teacher sought to find delightful words and to write accurate, truthful sayings. The words of the sages are like prods, and the collected sayings are like firmly fixed nails that are given by one shepherd. Be warned, my son, of anything in addition to them. There is no end to the making of many books, and much study is exhausting to the body. Having heard everything, I have reached this conclusion. Fear God and keep his commandments, because this is the whole duty of man. For God will evaluate every deed, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. Okay. So, you want to remember that the Bible is meant to be heard, and it was meant to be heard in totality. We have a tendency to read snippets of the Bible and look at them and then just go to town with those. And we're used to just collapsing things down to smaller and smaller and smaller parts, trying to get it here. So at work, we have issues because some of our programs will have a decimal point and 3 points after that. And then some will do 4 or 5, and then when it's finally all done, there's a bunch of rounding that goes off, and then the final numbers will be down to like 2 decimal points, and so they won't quite match. I mean, they're close enough. I mean, 5.45, 5.46, but our bosses over in India, they want it to be exactly matched. And we have to try to explain to them all this rounding's going off because they're just focused on one little thing, and they're not looking at the bigger picture of all the work that we're showing here. And we approach the Bible sometimes like that. So when I was reading, what verses or what ideas struck you as unusual? Yes, ma'am? Chapter 3 and verse 11. Yes, ma'am, I can tell you what chapter 3, verse 11 says. Oh, let's see here. Let's see, there's a time. Yes, yeah. Chapter 3 and verse 11 says, He has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also set eternity in their heart, yet so that no man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. Did you have a comment after that? It is. So I want you to understand that I went through Ecclesiastes. So when I start studying a book of the Bible, I read through it once or twice, and then I read through it and I just write questions. So Ecclesiastes, I over the course of a week, I wrote down my questions, and I had 250 odd questions, because there's just a lot of strange verses here. And due to my printing error here, I printed it different, so I turned it this way instead of flipping it this way here. So I kept getting myself lost from chapter to chapter, and it would really not make sense, and I would get myself confused, all the more so because so many verses are confusing. Like when it says money's the answer. Like when it talks about don't be excessively righteous, don't be excessively evil. You know, I mean, I remember reading a Peanuts strip, and Linus quoted Ecclesiastes saying, a live dog's better than a dead lion. And I'm like, what? That's in the Bible? I'm like, well, sure enough, it's in the Bible. Because you read it, and we have a tendency to read Ecclesiastes in a couple, 3 days, if you're going through the Bible in a year, and not a whole lot latches onto us, because we're usually more focused on trying to get to the New Testament, trying to get to the Gospels, trying to get the letters of Paul, trying to get to those parts we want. We're just trying to get through the Old Testament here. And that's unfortunate because Ecclesiastes has a lot of stuff to teach us. So, anything else jump out at anybody? Yes, ma'am? Cassie?
Chapter 10, verse 7 jumps out to me. Do not say, why were the old days better than these, for it is not wise to ask such questions. This is something I hear a lot, and I started saying, oh, it was better, and so that one jumped out to me.
Mary Sue?
I was listening, not reading.
Yes.
There was a part about man and animals
Mm-hmm.
and how they all have the same destination and all this. That was strange to me.
You know, Ecclesiastes is so strange. You guys can give me a commentator, and I can tell you if he was a liberal or conservative, and then you could say he wrote a commentary on Exodus. And depending on what he is, I can tell you what his interpretation is going to be for most of Exodus. And I can be right about 95% of the time, and I can go through all the books of the Bible and be just fine with that here. Ecclesiastes, however, is completely different. Nobody is consistent on their interpretation of Ecclesiastes. We have plenty of liberal authors, liberal meaning the rest of the books of the Bible they write about, they take a very liberal approach. There are no miracles. God may be real, may not be real. Jesus may not be, these sort of things here. And they'll take a very conservative approach to Ecclesiastes. We'll have very conservative authors who will write about, the book on Genesis that took place in 6 literal days, 7 days, and they get to Ecclesiastes and they'll say, well, this is all him saying his thoughts and none of it is true. They'll say that it's inspired in as much as it's recorded properly, so whoever said these things actually said these things, but they'll say that this isn't what God wants us to do. And then they'll hang their hat on the last verses of chapter 12 and say, this is all what God wants us to do, is to fear God, keep his commandments, and we need to ignore everything else in those preceding 12 chapters. And we have people that say it's an apologetic track meant to persuade you about various philosophies, that it's all about good things, that it's all about bad things, and it just runs the gambit, and nobody has a consistent thing here. So I'll tell you that I'll give you my interpretation, but I only have so much confidence in that interpretation because everything is just so different.
So how do you interpret 7:16, where it says, "Do not be overly righteous nor be overly wise"?
When we get to chapter 7, we'll definitely talk about that. So I want you to think about it, and I want you to work it out as the possibilities here. So Ecclesiastes is a book that you really need to pay into and think about it here. You know, we can read a parable, and because we've heard so much of the New Testament, because we've heard so many lessons about New Testament, because we have so many Christian ideas in our culture, we can make sense of most things in the parables. And we can arrive at a good answer, usually no problem. But Ecclesiastes just runs right across the grain, and we have a hard time figuring out what's going on because, for the most part, we don't deal with wisdom literature. Most people in the Brotherhood don't study Proverbs, don't study Job, don't study the Song of Songs, don't study Ecclesiastes, don't study anything like that. And when we do study it, it's just always very much superficial. Let's crank it out here. So when we study the book of Psalms, it's usually in a 13-week course, teacher will do some topical things. Here's some imprecatory psalms. Here's some intercessory psalms. Here's some psalms that are messianic, and we'll talk about a few things, and they'll just mention a few ideas and move on. Same with Proverbs. You know, we'll just say, here's some Proverbs they're talking about for work. Here's Proverbs talking about your marriage or who to marry, things along those lines here. And that doesn't really help us understand wisdom literature as a whole. So wisdom literature wasn't meant to be an absolute. Do we understand that? By that I mean, when it says, if you do good, you'll live long, that's found in wisdom literature all the time. But that's not an absolute. When Jesus says, believe in me and you'll be saved, well, that's an absolute. Whoever believes in him will be saved. That's just done. But wisdom literature is not like that. Wisdom literature is about wisdom, which means that there are some things that are going to be easy to understand, things that are going to be hard to understand. I imagine, and I could be wrong, but I imagine that most all of you have had any number of times in your life when you had to make a hard decision and you did not know the right answer. There was not clearly a right answer. There wasn't clearly a wrong answer. And you were just sort of shooting from the hip and just praying and hoping that you would make the best decision. And sometimes you'd find out afterwards, well, that wasn't the best decision. But in the moment, that was the best decision you know. And that's what wisdom is. In the moment, this is all the information we have, and we need to act on that and do the best we can. So in Ecclesiastes, you would have heard any number of verses talking about eat and drink and be joyful. But we don't think about Ecclesiastes promoting a good work ethic and saying that you should be happy in your work. Because that's not what we promote today. We don't teach from the pulpit, you should be a happy worker because God has given you that job. We promote that, okay, you should endure things. You should be a good witness in your workplace because Jesus is going to come. People are going to go to hell. People are going to go to heaven. You need to persevere. But Ecclesiastes doesn't say that there. We don't promote the idea that there's a time for everything. We pretty much teach people that you should always be happy. We acknowledge, especially right at the moment here, that death happens and you can be sad, but we want to align the grieving process down to a very manageable session. You know, I was telling my wife that I was thinking that the people in the olden times had it a little better with death than we do because they would have a wake. You know, you would have a person die, so your husband would die, and they would lay the person out on the table in the family room here. And then over the course of a week, the town, your members of your family, everybody would come by and talk with the family, interact, bring food, laugh, play games, do all kinds of things. And the family had a whole week to be reliving various memories, good and bad, seeing this loved one dead and processing that, and processing that, and processing that. And they would go to bed and get up and say, oh, here's my husband. He's right here. Or here's my son. Or here's my wife. And they would have a whole week to go through this here. And by the time the week was done, there would be a lot more closure. Now we just have funerals that are, wrapped up in an hour or so, and we have it divided up into a few different sections, and then we move on with our life. And nobody moves on fast after a death. But we just don't know how to deal with death. We don't know how to respond, and we talk to people and give them trite sayings saying, oh, they're in a better place. God's with them. God won't give you more than you can handle, so forth and so on. And in the moment of your suffering, that's just a load of garbage because that's not what God meant for us. And Ecclesiastes is pointing that out. He's like, this is totally garbage. I did all this work and bad things happened to me. Joe Blow over there was scumbag and nothing but good happens to him. How's that fair? Ecclesiastes works on that here. And he talks about good things, he talks about bad things, he talks about all kinds of things that you need to have some wisdom, which is why Ecclesiastes was read at the festivals every year, so that people will grow hearing these things and realizing that in our day-to-day life, we oftentimes give trite answers. But God knows there are no trite answers. And God knows that the things that happen in this life, sometimes we're not going to understand. We're not going to be able to comprehend. We're not going to be able to accept because from our limited point of view, it was wrong or it's unfair or it's confusing or this is against what you said over here, here, and here. And the author there is trying to get you to understand a lot of it is because God is God and we're just here. And we can't understand it. Yes, sir?
Yeah, do we know if this was written toward the end of Solomon's life or was it early in his life or late in his life toward the end?
We don't know that Solomon wrote it. No, Solomon talks about writing the Proverbs. He doesn't talk about writing this. So he may have well wrote it. And I have no problem him writing here or whatnot here. One of the questions I put down when I was reading it here, let's see, do I have my Bible up here? Okay. So, he says, the words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. And then he says in verse 12, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem. And he talks a few more times. Oh, yeah, in verse 15, behold, I have magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me. Thank you. And my mind has observed the wealth of wisdom and knowledge here. So, one of the questions I wrote down, because I was raised with it being Jerusalem or Solomon, that if it's Solomon, that verse has a tendency not to make sense because the only king before him was who? Chapter 1 and in verse 16. Yeah. I have magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me. My mind has observed the wealth of wisdom and knowledge. So, if it's Solomon, the only person who was king before him was David. Unless he's trying to mean non-kings. Saul was king, but he wasn't considered king. So, everything started with David, and whatnot here. But if it's somebody way after him, well, it makes sense. You got 20 kings, 10 kings, 15 kings, or whatnot here. The question to ask yourself is, does it affect our interpretation if Solomon wrote it or didn't write it?
Well, I just wondered because, a lot of people think, well, Solomon never did really, apostatize,
Mhm.
It sounds like he might have come back.
And that is one reason why we interpret it that way here, because we want Solomon to come back in here. Yes, sir? Well, that's a possibility, but here's what I want you to remember, is that in the final analysis, this is the Word of God. So whether Solomon wrote it, Hezekiah wrote it, or some unnamed guy wrote it way down at the end, it doesn't matter. I don't know if you've ever looked at the Bible, but the authorship of each individual book is rarely pointed out. You know, the Gospels, we don't have pointed out their authors, except for Luke. Matthew, Mark, and John don't point out that I, John, wrote this, I, Matthew, wrote this, I, Mark, wrote this. We have church tradition here, which is fine, and there's nothing wrong with that. Paul wrote down a number of his letters, and some other letters, we have that. The Old Testament, the prophets say, I wrote these things here. The books of history, we don't know. The books of Moses, we have Jesus saying, Moses wrote those. Okay. So half the books we got authors, half the books we don't, but that's why we always teach it's God who's the author. So whether Solomon wrote this or not is immaterial because God recorded it and he wants us to deal with it here. Which is why we don't usually teach this much in the church, because there's no easy answers about Ecclesiastes. I can give you an easy answer on a proverb. Train up a child in the way he should go. When he's old, he won't depart from that. And we can have discussion about whether that's an absolute promise, whether that's a hypothetical promise, whether it applies in this situation, that situation. We can talk about that, and we can make some sense and some headway about that. But don't be overly righteous. Don't be overly wicked is more difficult. Money is the answer is more difficult. Eat, drink, be merry, well, that's a little more difficult. Everything in here is just more difficult, which is why he's saying that I've done these things, and this is what I've discovered, and so we have to figure out what he really is trying to say. And so when you go home this week, what you need to be thinking about is, why has God put this in here for us? What is it that he wants us to get from it? Is this just an entire book of garbage, except for the last few verses where it says, fear God and keep his commandments? So everybody across the spectrum, no matter what their interpretation of Ecclesiastes is, will say good things about those last few verses. It's the previous 12 chapters worth of verses that everybody gets confused about and has a wide variety of opinions. I got one set of commentaries where the author, he spent 1,500 pages, 2 volumes on Ecclesiastes. He did just a few years ago here. And he says that his conclusions are just sort of tentative. Okay? And he doesn't have a great deal of confidence. He has some confidence, but not a great deal of confidence in his understanding of that. Now, 1,500 pages worth of study, and that's what he recorded, let alone what he drew from, and all he can say is, I'm tentative, gives you an idea that Ecclesiastes is just a different sort of book. So we're going to have to spend some time thinking about it, which is one more reason why I want you to be reading it and thinking about it here, because it's easy to take a verse and flip it against another verse in Ecclesiastes and say, see, the Bible contradicts itself. And you want to be aware these verses exist because people who are against the Bible use these verses all the time and say, well, there we know. This is why we know the Bible wasn't inspired, because this guy says this and this says over here, and so why is it there? But I want you to keep reminding yourself that Jesus, every year of his life, he heard Ecclesiastes being read with his family. Every year of his life, he heard the words of the King of Jerusalem. Words of Solomon, words of a different king, doesn't matter. It was the words of God. Every year he heard this being recited with all the nation, and all these sort of confusing things that are confusing to us may not have been as confusing to him, but it definitely talks to us about wisdom. And the older I've gotten, the more I realize that there are plenty of things that are black and white, but there are plenty of things that are just not as black and white. I remember a teacher telling me when I was in school, he was in the midst of trying to squash some sort of false doctrine that was coming out. It might have been about marriage, forced marriage, who knows. And he was talking with one of his professors and saying, well, what's the right answer? And the guy said, well, this is the right answer. The teacher said, well, where's your verse? And the guy paused. He's like, well, I don't have a verse. It's just a wisdom sort of thing here. But what he did point him to was the book of Hebrews in chapter 5 at the end where it says, by this time you ought to have been teachers. Instead, you're having people need milk instead of meat. Those who have meat have trained their senses to discern between good and evil. That's the course of wisdom, to train our senses to discern between good and evil. Because God doesn't spell out every single evil thing or every single good thing. Yes, sir?
Yeah, there's, different levels of truth in the Bible. There's a surface meaning, and then you can go deeper, just in one verse. And that might be, that's probably the case here in Ecclesiastes. There are truths that mean, one thing to one person and something else to another person.
That's a possibility. So, okay.
I mean, it's not just black. It's not just all black and white.
And, yes, sir?
Me, this, I mean, I don't know if this makes sense or not, but me, Ecclesiastes reminds me of, well, still to this day, it's like parents arguing with their teenage kid. Just about life, because you're trying to, and us as teenagers too, we were the same way to our parents, we were always bucking things, or, why do this, why do, mom says, go clean your room. Why do I need to clean my room? How does that affect the way I live my life? So it's kind of, I mean, I don't know.
No, I think that's a great analogy because Ecclesiastes does take a certain amount of wisdom that you only obtain through time. We could hypothetically train our children to memorize the Bible at a very young age and get them to memorize large swaths of that. But memorization does not equal wisdom. It just means that you have the chance to be wise. But that means all of us have the chance to be wise because we have the Bible in front of us too. And we can go through life and realize how many stupid decisions we've made, even though we know the truth. There's just so many factors that affect us here. And so wisdom is just something that takes time. This is why, as a general rule, the Bible teaches that the elders should be the older men. Not because older men are richer or more powerful, but because by sheer dint of experience, they should have learned some things that 20 and 30-year-olds have not had a chance to learn. I had one teacher who had one child, one girl. That's what he always called her, the girl, in class and whatnot here. And it's good that you have a child. When you don't have a child, you don't learn certain things until you have a child. And when you have a child, you learn certain things. When you have multiple children, you learn more things. When you have both genders, you learn more. Carrie's telling me that she can go to parks with a lot of the mothers that she gets together with, and she can always see the mothers who only have daughters or who only have sons. The ones who only have daughters are very much, your boys are too loud. They need to quiet down. They need to settle down. They don't need to be running across it. They don't need to be doing this here. And because they don't have experience with boys. Boys are just filled with energy, and they've just got to be moving. And that's what boys do. And people who have only boys can't get over girls, how quiet and well-behaved and just sort of respectful and just like, wow, they can just do so many things here. But all these things give us this experience and this wisdom that takes place over time. And these are the things that we need to be drawing on and bringing towards Ecclesiastes. So, in the time of Jesus, after the time of Jesus, in about AD 110, there was a council that was held at Jamaica because Jerusalem had been destroyed, the Jews had been dispersed, and the rabbis got together and firmed up saying that these are the books that are the complete revelation of the Old Testament. Not that they would call it the Old Testament. These are the books that we have that God has given us from the beginning to the end. And Ecclesiastes was included on that. Okay? We know that Jesus would have heard Ecclesiastes, and while there are different groups over time who want to get rid of it, just like they want to get rid of the Song of Songs or get rid of Job, that's not the case. God has all power, and if God did not want it in his Bible, it had been nothing for him to take it out. We have it here, so we need to deal with it, and by deal with it, I mean we need to grow through it here. So we have got to read these things and think about these things and realize that they're not simple, trite answers. Don't lie. Be polite. Close the door. Those sort of things here. There are just a lot more difficult answers here, and realize that whatever interpretation we give for a lot of these verses, it's just going to be tentative because it's hard to make it all fit in the rest of the Old Testament and the rest of the New Testament. And so I'll always remind you that this clear verse over here in the New Testament is going to trump this confusing verse in the Old Testament. So however we take the question Wendell was asking about more righteous, more wicked, we know for a fact that Paul and Jesus said, do good things. Don't do bad things. So however we interpret that, we've got to make it mesh with this right here. And it's got to make sense as to why God would even interpret it, why he'd even put it in there. And Ecclesiastes seems to go out of his way, the author seems to go out of his way to make things difficult and challenging for us. It's like he's trying to rile us up every possible way. Any final questions or thoughts? Yes, ma'am.
I guess I'm just different. Something I love Ecclesiastes.
Oh, awesome.
The poetry, I love the prose stuff. And for me, it's God basically saying, life is complicated. Don't worry about it. Live your life. Live fully. Work hard and love me.
And see, that's the interpretation I end up coming down on. that is exactly what I think, that there are no easy answers. And when we think there are easy answers, we just haven't actually got enough wisdom, which usually means God's going to put some trials in your life. You're like, oh, I thought I knew the truth, and then God made it a lot more complicated for me, which is what children do. You know, they make it more complicated for you here. Any other questions, Tabitha? Oh, okay, just checking. Yes, sir.
Why did you pick that version to read?
You know, so when I was doing my questions, I usually pick a couple translations. So I have New American Standard. That's one I'll teach from here. And I picked one that was going to be slightly more clear. And
There's one that just says continually, everything is meaningless.
well, yes.
And that word wasn't in your...
No. We'll talk about Hevel and the meaning of that. And it's complicated. So next week, we'll talk, and that's what I mean. Everything about Ecclesiastes is complicated, down to the authorship. It's complicated. And so that's why everybody's got all kinds of interpretations.
The reason I asked is because I like that because it goes right with blowing in the wind.
I understand here. So please read Ecclesiastes again. Do your best. Listen to it. Pick a different translation than you're normally used to, and listen to it, because that'll generate some questions and thoughts in your mind here. And then we'll cover some introductory material and part of the first chapter next week. Class dismissed.